Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another BOA Debate Key Concepts video. Today, we're going to be talking about Russia's nuclear doctrine and how it's changed over time, and how you can integrate this knowledge into your debate rounds on this Baltics topic, and as well as a lot of future topics. So, starting off, there are some claims made about the. Let me just move this real quick. I'm going to move this over here. There are some claims made about the Russian Federation's doctrine, and there's this pervasive idea of a lowered nuclear threshold. The idea that the Russian Federation over time has stated either through words or through deeds or signal through deeds that it is more likely to use nuclear weapons first than in the past. And there are three kind of supporting pieces of evidence for this that people claim. The first is that there's an alleged escalate to de-escalate doctrine, that this is something that Russian leadership in the military and in the civilian leadership, talk about behind closed doors. The second is that over time, the Russian Federation has increased their tactical nuclear weapons arsenal, especially comparatively to what they had as the legacy, as the successor state of the Soviet Union. And the third is that there's this idea that the Russian Federation could have a lightning strike to seize territory and then combine that with threats to kind of hold off invasion from NATO or other foreign powers. There's a lot of fears around this about the Baltic states particularly. And to note, this is different from the concept that we discussed in the A280 video that talks about how the kind of like a conventional way to ensure this threat. That's simply that the cost to lives would be very high if NATO were to attempt to like liberate the Baltics theoretically, and that is different from this kind of nuclear threat. Now, a few quick responses that we're gonna maybe develop a little bit throughout this. The first is that there's no evidence for the first piece. The declaratory doctrine tends actually towards an increased threshold, and the purpose of declaratory nuclear doctrine is that your adversary has an idea about what you're going to do, and you don't really get that much benefit out of your doctrine when you declare it if you're kind of just making things up as you go along, especially if it's contradictory to what you've said. The second is that, this large tactical nuclear weapons arsenal is actually offset by an increasingly large conventional arsenal, an increasingly modernized conventional arsenal, and that a lot of the tactical nuclear weapons, and by tactical nuclear weapons, we mean nuclear weapons that would only be used at a small scale, right? Not the idea of we're going to try to take out the entirety of the United States or the EU, but simply to like manipulate battlefields and battlefronts. And then for the third, this is not even really evidence for the original claim, but this is still something that gets said. Just because maybe Russia has the capability to do this does not mean that there's necessarily a lowered nuclear threshold. And as I've already talked about, the conventional arsenal serves just as well for this kind of idea. Now, before we talk about, I'm going to be moving this throughout the video a lot, I think. Before we talk about the Russian Federation's nuclear doctrine, we also have to talk, at least briefly, about the USSR's doctrine. It changes slightly over time, but as technology develops and second-strike capabilities were ensured, there was a switch towards a declaratory policy of no first use, which means that the USSR would not use nuclear weapons unless an adversary power used nuclear weapons first upon them. Now, immediately after the Soviet Union, the doctrine that's kind of instilled by Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation, is there's a revocation of no first use. And there's a few reasons for this. The first is that there's very widespread chaos after the collapse of the USSR. The life expectancy in the former Soviet republics went down by about 10 years overall. these economic linkages get cut off, which hurts the economy. There's like widespread looting by foreign capitalists, foreign corporations, and kind of a consolidation very quickly of what used to be social goods into the hands of private individuals. As part of this chaos, Soviet strategic weapons had been spread around 4 states: Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, which meant that it was a lot more difficult to ensure second strike capabilities. And this is also the beginning of a serious conventional disparity. By the end of the Cold War, the USSR and NATO are basically on even footing. But now, again, suddenly, all of these weapons and arms that the Soviet Union had are not necessarily things that the Russian Federation have. And there's a denunciation by Yeltsin of tactical nuclear weapons. However, over time, he kind of begins backtracking on this for experiences that we're going to be talking about shortly. But just for context, in case people don't know, so this is Russia, right? This is Kazakhstan in Central Asia. This is Belarus, and this is Ukraine. So this area is about where a lot of these strategic weapons are, these nuclear weapons, and other kind of weapons of mass destruction that we would call them. And now suddenly, instead of them all being in one union of states, they're spread around amongst 4 states. And then kind of just a quick historical anecdote, because I think it's funny. It also kind of speaks to the relationship that, even though this revocation of no first use happened, there wasn't really that much anxiety about a potential nuclear war. So this is, it would be funny. It would be really funny if it wasn't so sad. But basically, in 1996, Bill Clinton sends over 3 different advisors and helps Yeltsin win re-election. And it's crazy that this happened, and this is just something that Time talks about. And there's this C-SPAN video of these advisors talking about this, and they just very much straight up speak to the fact that they manipulated the Russian public and helped Yeltsin win re-election because it was in the interests of the United States and not necessarily in the interests of the Russian people. So I'm just going to include that in the sources because I think it's something people should know about. But anyways, U.S. interventions end up changing the equation for the Russian nuclear doctrine. We talked about this a little bit in the A2AD Key Concepts video, but the Gulf War and then later the 98-99 Kosovo War, where NATO intervened, caused a lot of anxieties in the Russian military, in the Russian leadership about the United States and NATO potentially invading Russia, and that they wouldn't really be able to do anything about that. So as we've talked about in the past, the Gulf War was very, very fast. It only lasted 43 days. And that was because of overwhelming technological superiority by the United States military, very much specifically in the air, which allowed them to basically do whatever they wanted, complete mobility, complete freedom. The Kosovo War was a little bit longer. It officially lasted 468 days, but when the NATO bombing campaign began in March of 1999, it only ended up lasting 79 more days, right? So this is another clear piece of evidence that Western, NATO, US air superiority has a very big effect on the fundamental military equation of the time. And also one of the reasons why NATO intervention in the Kosovo War really freaked out Russia was because the 91 Gulf War had been sanctioned by the UN Security Council, but the NATO intervention in the Kosovo War had not been sanctioned by the UN Security Council. So suddenly, this idea that international law is going to prevail for the day, that we're going to respect the things set down by the United Nations, it is not true, right? That assumption goes out the window. And again, this continued economic collapse or the economic chaos after the collapse of the Soviet Union let the United States gain a serious conventional edge. The Russian military had nowhere anything close to the capabilities that the NATO militaries demonstrated at this time. And because of this, Russia began to signal a willingness to use nuclear weapons. So in the 1999 Zapad exercise, which was the first major military exercise after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they simulated a nuclear strike. And they even said at their the press conference afterwards, this was a simulated nuclear strike because they wanted NATO to know that they had the capabilities and willingness to use nuclear weapons. And the 2000 nuclear doctrine, the year 2000 nuclear doctrine, asserted the right to use nuclear weapons in, quote, situations critical to the national security of the Russian Federation. And that was left vague on purpose, right? They do list out some of the instances, but it's a lot vaguer than language that happens in some of the later nuclear doctrines. So this is what the situation looks like in the 2000s. Now, later on, modernization kind of begins to change this equation, the modernization of the Russian military. So there are some fears continuously of US/NATO conventional capabilities, specifically in the quantitative and qualitative improvements in precision strike capabilities, the abilities to launch a missile from very far away and to hit very specific targets. Both the quantitative increase in the number of these missiles and then also the improvement of the technology. Now, a secondary aspect of this is also the beginnings of a European missile defense system. So this is a theme that you'll see throughout kind of knowledge of Russian national security concerns, the Russian military, is that they have a very big fear, and this is also true of China, that they have this very big fear that if they don't have guaranteed second strike capabilities, right, don't have guaranteed capabilities to, in the event of the United States launching nuclear weapons at Russia or at China, right, if they can't send nuclear weapons back, they worry, and this is a very reasonable worry, that the United States would then maybe consider it in its interest to launch those nuclear weapons. So the nightmare scenario for these improved conventional capabilities are that they're able to target the nuclear silos and the nuclear kind of triads that exist in Russia. And then whatever nuclear weapons are left would no longer be a threat to Europe or to the United States. And that therefore this would change the military calculus for the US and NATO militaries. Now, part of this, right, their attempts to offset this was their own increasing of offensive and defensive conventional capabilities. So their own beginning of improvements for precision strike technology. And then this is also, kind of the A280 systems and their embryonic states. This is the beginning of the development of the S-400 system, as well as the Pantsir. And then a secondary way that they kind of offset this fear is through strategic nuclear signaling. And what that means essentially is that they began to use their bombers to kind of begin patrolling some of the same areas that the Soviet Union used to patrol during the Cold War to kind of signal their readiness to use nuclear weapons at any moment if they needed to. And they also began doing similar things with their nuclear submarines or their submarines with nuclear capable missiles in parts of, I believe it's called the Arctic Strategic Bastion or the Northern Strategic Bastion or something like that. I actually kind of forget right now in the moment, but this is to signal to the United States and NATO that we have nuclear weapons and we're capable and ready to use them. Though, even though they're kind of signaling more that they can use these nuclear weapons, they actually walk back the declaratory doctrine a little bit. And that's a very key point of information. So it's lowered, or the threshold is increased to they're reserving the right to use nuclear weapons when the very existence of the state is under threat. And basically, it's not as listed out as the 2000 doctrine, but what Western military what Western analysts come to conclude is like a significant threat to the conventional capabilities of Russia, to their nuclear capabilities, to like the civilian and economic infrastructure of Russia would be a threat to the very existence of the state itself. And this rhetoric is also important. This part of the declaratory doctrine is also important because in 2009, the Russian parliament passed a law that the Russian military does not have to ask for parliamentary permission to protect the rights of Russian nationals, of Russian speaking and Russian cultural people in other countries. And this is a product, right? This diaspora of Russians is a product of the Soviet Union falling. So in 2009, when they signed this law, a lot of analysts began freaking out, like, oh my gosh, are they going to invade the Baltics? Because around this time, the Baltics still had a very serious problem about kind of these chauvinistic, these discriminatory policies, these non-integrative policies towards Russian speakers in their country. So there's this worry about this. But then the 2010 military doctrine comes out and says, we're only going to use nuclear weapons when the very existence of the state is under threat, which means that, you know, even though the Russian military reserves the right to invade the Baltic states if they think the rights of Russian-speaking peoples are threatened, they wouldn't use nuclear weapons. They wouldn't threaten to use nuclear weapons to do so, which is a very big distinction to make. And so if people are running these hybrid warfare impacts about, oh, Russian invasion to protect the rights of Russian-speaking citizens and like they're going to use nuclear weapons, yada, 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 this is evidence against this. Now, modernization continues to change the equation, bringing us up to 2014 through 2020 in the modern day. And this is really the period that the Western analysts begin really, really freaking out about the US, or not the US, the Russian nuclear doctrine. Before, it was kind of just, you know, a very niche area study that people weren't all that concerned about. But in 2014, when the Russian military occupied Ukraine very quickly in order to ensure war and water access to the Sevastopol port, because the Ukrainian government that had just couped the previous government was backed and friendly to the United States. And therefore, you know, Russia saw its sovereignty at risk, and that's why it invaded Ukraine, barring any other considerations. This is when the Western analysts begin really freaking out. But it's also the beginning of the Russian military gaining some like practical experience and showing off what they were beginning to become capable of because of the modernization efforts that had begun in the early 2000s, but were really kind of gaining in maturity around now. I don't know what happened there, but let's kind of get back to this. So there was basically the Russian military had an increasingly assertive presence in the world and got some real experience, which, you know, before 2014, there was kind of this partial attitude in the West still. And I was 14 at this time, and some of you would have been 6 when 2014 happened, and that's kind of crazy to me. But if you read kind of what people are talking about from back then and these ideas of our attitudes towards Russia, it was a lot less antagonistic, right? And part of that was basically because we a little bit assumed that Russia would just like roll over and not really take action to defend what it perceived as its very vital national security interests, like the war in Water Port. And so when Russia becomes assertive in these two conflicts, that begins freaking out a lot of people. And then there's a lot of talk about a lower nuclear threshold and things along those lines. However, that's not true. And as this modernization process happens, there's an expansion of the conventional capabilities. So new ways to ensure the threat of conventional strikes, the development of things like hypersonic missiles, the development of new attack submarines with capabilities to launch new sea-launched missiles, there's again an improved ability to deflect adversarial conventional strikes. This is really when the A280 system begins coming into its maturity. There's also an expansion of tactical nuclear capabilities. And one dynamic of how a lot of these tactical nuclear capabilities interact is that they're dual use, right? That the missiles that they're developing can not only hold conventional loads, they can also hold nuclear loads. And this is the beginning of the time where the Russian military and the Russian leadership is beginning to talk about how it's important for them to begin to maintain this air of less directly saying when they're going to be using nuclear weapons. Because in the 2000 doctrine, they lay it out completely. In the 2010 doctrine, the military doctrine, they say it in a very clear way, the threat of like the sovereignty of this, the very existence of the state itself is at risk, but they don't quite list what that means. And this is the beginning of the time where they're intentionally trying to be a little bit more ambiguous because it allows them some breathing room for maybe some hybrid warfare actions or for some other actions. But it's still the same fundamental of the very existence of the state itself is at risk. And in 2014, the 2014 military doctrine, they introduced non-nuclear deterrence, which should also be part of this conversation. So at one level, they're saying, we're going to keep it a little bit more ambiguous about when we might use nuclear weapons, but they're also strictly saying, we like having non-nuclear deterrence because it allows us to have a little bit more flexibility when it comes to escalation, right? Because one of the weaknesses of having to rely upon solely nuclear deterrence is that there's not very much to go, right? There's really a very small limit of what you can do without bringing upon the apocalypse, right? Which is not something that anybody wants. So the 2014 military doctrine is the first time they introduced the term of non-nuclear deterrence. And it's clear that, conventional precision strike technology is becoming increasingly important. In the 2020 nuclear doctrine, they affirmed nuclear weapons as a weapons of last resort. And they specifically said no preemption, that the only time they would use nuclear weapons would be if they knew an attack was coming, right? They knew an attack was through the Russian border, that Russia had been attacked, Russia's being attacked, right? Because there's this worry, throughout the history of nuclear weapons of miscalculation, right? So this is kind of another argument that you can use in debate rounds, like this understanding that these are weapons of last resort. It's specifically not preemption, right? So if there's miscalculation, it is much, much less likely to be on the Russian side than to be on the NATO side, where we have this doctrine of flexible deterrence that's actually very similar to the ambiguity that begins cropping up in Russian nuclear doctrine, where it's basically like that crazy emoji, and it's like, well, we might do this kind of whenever we want. So watch out. And yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else, but I don't really think there is. So if people are running arguments about how, Russia's going to use nuclear weapons, right, to ensure they can invade the Baltics, that's not true. They would not do that. If people, at least we're pretty sure they won't do that, right? Because that's what they said they were going to do. And despite what people might have you believe, leaders of other countries actually tend to keep their word, even if they are adversaries of the United States. One other thing I want to also highlight is that if you are running a pro contention about expanding missile defense systems into the Baltics, again, that probably is not a risk of nuclear war, but it definitely, evidentially, right? Who knows if people are going to actually run this argument against you, but that this is something that the Russian Federation has explicitly said is a concern to them for the reasons that it might impact their ability to guarantee second strike capabilities, right? And it might seem a little bit perverse, a little bit twisted to be like, oh, you know, we should let Russia be able to attack us, right? Or we should let Russia be able to attack US allies. But at the end of the day, I do think that there is a sound logic to the idea of really mutually assured destruction, right? Because that's what it comes down to. That when we expand our defensive capabilities too much, we impact the ability for mutually assured destruction to exist. Because if the United States might have the chance of really taking out Russia, taking out even just the sovereignty of the country, right? By targeting the nuclear missiles and then that laying the groundwork for a conventional invasion, that's something to be worried about, right? And that the Russian military, the Russian Federation, the Russian leadership would probably preempt before it really got to the point where that was possible, right? And that creates the risk of escalation, it creates the risk of an arms race, and creates the risk of conflict. So that's something to be concerned about. And then also, again, as I already said, you can be talking about this in the context of just really any kind of nuclear war scenario with Russia. If the scenario isn't talking about how it would require the United States and NATO to like invade Russia first to really attack the sovereignty of Russia as an independent state, then it's probably a pretty bad nuclear war scenario, and it's not based in reality. And I'm going to be putting resources, as always, into the post so that you can maybe read these things a little bit more in depth. And I also will be cutting a few cards on some of the more specific things. So for instance, I want to cut a card about this 2020 doctrine and how it, in the 2017 doctrine and how it revolves around missile defense, right? And the idea that ballistic missile defense could be seen as a threat against Russian sovereignty and could provoke some kind of response. So look forward to that very soon. Like it should actually be on the post when you see this. Please like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. It's really awesome to see support from the community and to see our viewership go up. You don't need a WordPress account to subscribe to WordPress. You literally just need an email, and then you'll be notified much easier when we send things out. And if we ever send out a special email to subscribers, letting you know about things, letting you know about opportunities for things like practice debates or evidence cutting sessions or things like that. I hope you have a nice day, and I hope you do well in whatever tournaments you have upcoming this weekend. Goodbye.